I'm photographer David duChemin, and this is Vision is Better, a sometimes weekly podcast about the craft and art of photography. Welcome here. Hey, today I want to talk to you about exposure. I want to talk about histograms, and I want to talk about highlight warnings. Now, this is for people that are photographing digitally, so digital exposure is going to be different than if you're photographing with film. I assume if you're photographing with film, you've already got kind of a bit of a handle on this. I personally, when I photograph, I am 99% of the time, I'm in manual exposure mode. I used to use AV mode a lot, aperture priority, and I still do if things are moving really quickly and if the light's not changing a lot, but increasingly I really like the control of manual. So I've gone back to manual exposure. That's the way I do it. It doesn't have to be the way you do it, but I feel like I'm more in control when I'm photographing manually. The other thing that I feel like with manual is that I'm much more attuned to what the light is doing. I've learned to see light better now that I've returned to photographing manual. Of course, you know, when I started, all I had was like a Pentax Spotmatic and a roll of 100 ISO film. And the only option I had was to learn to do it manually. I got lazy when I started to use AV or TV mode. Those are helpful. They're very helpful modes when things are moving quickly and when the light is changing like crazy. Sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes you have to really second guess the camera and keep an eye on it and use your EV. So I have found, generally speaking, that manual mode works better. What has been the most important for me in terms of my exposure is learning how to read a histogram. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Histogram is really very simple. There's two kinds of histograms. There's kind of an RGB histogram, which will show you a graph with three different colors: your red, your green, and your blue. And then there's just kind of your grayscale histogram. The grayscale histogram will show you one graph. So you get a very simple representation of where in terms of your chosen exposure, where your blacks sit and where your whites sit, and then of course everything in between. You could look at one scene and make an exposure, and your histogram could be all over on one side. You could look at it and it could all over on the other side. You can control that, and I will show you some histograms as we talk through this. What you cannot control is really, unless you introduce strobes, unless you change the light in the scene, you can't control the shape of the histogram. So there is no ideal shape for a histogram. Don't get bent out of shape if things are going out of the top of the frame on your histogram. Where the histogram is helpful is showing you where your blacks are and where your whites are, and that's important stuff. Now, here's what you need to know about the histogram. There's a couple things. First of all, I don't generally use the RGB histogram. It can be very helpful, but I prefer the simplicity of just a grayscale histogram. If you were shooting something like, you know, really bright red flowers, you might choose to use your RGB histogram so that you could keep an eye on that red channel and make sure you're not losing detail there, because it'll strip out those three channels and show you very specific information. I don't generally do that. I prefer the grayscale histogram. So the grayscale histogram, or any histogram, is showing you a graph of the data based on a JPEG preview in camera of your image. What this means is you're going to have more flexibility than it actually shows that you have. So if you're photographing RAW, and I recommend that you consider it, because RAW files are much more robust, they're much deeper and bigger, and they will give you more flexibility, especially at the beginning when maybe you're not quite dialed in with your exposures and you might kind of need a little bit more leeway. With a JPEG, you know, if you really blow those highlights, you maybe only have a stop to play with in Lightroom. If you're shooting in RAW, you have several stops, often several stops to play with in terms of recovering lost details if you've completely blown the exposure. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is that the histogram, while it gives you, you know, a rectangular box with values all the way from left to right, the histogram itself does not show you it's not distributed equally, and I'm struggling here because I understand the histogram, but it's really hard to explain. If you have a histogram from left to right, the information kind of does this and takes up the whole histogram. The black and white values in your image, the data, is not evenly distributed. There is much more data on the right side of the histogram than there is on the left side. There's more data in the light tones and the highlights than there is in the shadows, which is why if you expose so hard over to the left into the shadows, you underexpose by 3 stops. When you try to pull that data out, you're pulling it out of a smaller bucket. You have much less data and therefore much less flexibility in terms of your file. The best digital negative, assuming you're going to go to Lightroom and you're going to tinker around and play, is the one with the most amount of data. The most amount of data, all right? So if you expose more to the right, you're putting more data into a bigger bucket. That's all you need to know in terms of why you need to expose to the right. Yes, you can bring it back, and oftentimes beginners will start shooting with a histogram and they'll say, yeah, but my stuff looks all too bright and washed out. That's okay. Don't use the LCD for figuring out your exposure and what the colors are going to look like. Use your LCD for composition. Use your histogram to figure out your exposure. All right, that's important stuff. Now, once you've wrapped your mind around the fact that the histogram just simply represents in sort of numbers what your scene looks like, then all you have to do is make the photograph, make sure that that histogram is sitting as much as you can over the right side of the frame without going too far off. Now, this is where people make a religion out of the histogram. You got to be careful that you're not sweating the whole right side of the histogram thing too much. If you're photographing a landscape and the sun is in the shot, you're going to have lost highlights. There are no highlights in the sun. And so I've seen people, they're trying to photograph a scene and they're trying so desperately to get those highlights back in. They're gone, man. Let them go, because they were never there in the first place. If you're photographing a wedding and there's sunlight glinting off the forks on the table, there are going to be specular highlights. You're not going to get detail back in those. So don't sweat it out. The question is not, does my histogram go off the right side? Oh my God, I'm losing detail. The question is, which details are you using? Which detail are you losing? And I would suggest that you turn on, most cameras have some kind of function. It's usually called highlight warnings. You're turning on the blinkies so that when you look down at the LCD on your camera, you're not just seeing the histogram, but you're seeing blinking warnings on the image itself, on the back of that LCD. And so it will tell you which details you're losing. So if you're photographing the sun in a landscape, you're going to get the sun blinking, saying you've got no detail here, you're off the right hand side. Then you don't have to worry too much about it. But if it's the entire sky or if it's the side of a face, then you know you've lost detail there, and you probably want detail back there, and you're going to want to underexpose it until you get to a point where you've regained those details. The same is true in the shadows. Sometimes you're photographing a scene that just has so much range, dynamic range from the shadows to the lights that you can't get it all in, and you have to make a decision. Is it more important to me to have detail in the highlights, or is it more important to me to have detail in the shadows? And which ones am I going to lose? It's okay to lose details in the shadows if you don't want them there. You gain mystery that way. You gain solid shapes that way. Which is more powerful to you? Do you want a silhouette of a person and therefore make them more abstract and maybe more symbolic? Or do you want detail in their face? That's a question that only you can answer. But there's no reason why a photograph, strictly speaking, can't have plunged shadows or blown highlights. And that's where I think I react most strongly to this idea that you have to make sure that you've got your highlights and your shadows fully within the image. And so that's where people kind of resort to HDR, high dynamic range imaging. And I don't have a problem per se with that, except that it's just one tool. There's no reason why every photograph has to have detail everywhere. In fact, you lose a little bit of the logic of light that way. That's why some of the overdone HDR stuff, it causes a reaction. People think it looks a little surreal. It doesn't look quite right. We've lived our whole lives according to the logic of light. Now we're destroying it by bringing in far too much detail when we know it's not there. It just doesn't feel right. So in terms of your exposure, you want to get the best digital file, and the best digital file is the most robust, the one with the most data, which means exposing as much to the right of that histogram as you can without losing detail that you actually want. The only way to know which details you're losing is to turn on those highlight warnings. So turn on the highlight warnings, start photographing with your histogram on. Don't worry about the LCD. It's going to look a little washed out. It's going to look a little bit too bright. And that's okay. That's all right, because you're going to, in Lightroom later, you're going to dial it back. Most of us have our monitors set way too bright anyway, so you're going to dial that down too, and your stuff will start printing better. The reason most people's prints look too dark is because A, they're too worried about exposing to the right, and they're underexposing it chronically, and then they put it on screens like this, and their screens are too bright, and so they're underexposing it even more. Turn your screen, calibrate your monitors. Your brightness should probably start around 50% of what's possible in terms of calibrating for a printer. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. If you've got questions about this kind of stuff, leave them in the comments, and please do subscribe. And, you know, start shooting manually. Give it a try. You may not want it for your more serious shoots if you're used to program modes like AV or time value, shutter priority, but give it a try. Go out and shoot manual for a day when it doesn't really count, and see if you can't get a little more comfortable with moving your histogram around, exposing to the right, and getting the most optimal exposures for the kind of work that you want to do. Remember, there's no rules, but they're good solid principles, and if you give yourself a little push, a little more to the right, get that histogram over, you'll have more leeway. It's also true that the low light, that our sensors are getting so much better that pulling things out of the shadows isn't as hard as it used to be, and so we have a lot of leeway, but you only have that leeway if you shoot RAW. If you're shooting JPEG, it's not going to be there. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.